Welcome back to the Fast Times News YouTube channel. We're doing a deep dive today, and one that a lot of you have been asking for. It's about something that's pretty fundamental to how our country works. You know, something that usually stays in the legal textbooks, but suddenly it's blown up and hit the headlines. What happens when a sitting president might be, well, a criminal?
Yeah, it's fascinating that we're not dealing with what ifs anymore. We're looking at two real federal criminal cases against President Trump that have just been dismissed because he won the 2024 election.
And it's not just the legalities that have people talking. You know, it's what this situation says about conflicts of interest. At the highest levels of power, makes you wonder, can anyone, even the president, really be held accountable under the law?
It really challenges our assumptions, doesn't it? And these weren't, small charges. One case was about Trump's alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election results. And the other one was about how he handled classified documents. After leaving office, special counsel Jack Smith, he was leading these investigations. And he said publicly that he thought the evidence was strong.
So why were the cases dismissed? What could be stronger than hard evidence in this kind of situation?
It comes down to a long-standing Department of Justice policy. That prevents indicting a sitting president. Now, this policy isn't some new thing that Trump invented. It's been around for decades. And it's based on the idea that putting a president through criminal proceedings while they're in office could really mess up their ability to govern. Can you imagine a president having to go back and forth between the White House and the courthouse? It could throw the entire country into chaos.
Okay, that makes sense practically. But it also creates this possibility, unsettling possibility, that a president is basically immune from prosecution while in office. Right. It makes you think back to Trump's campaign speeches. He always told his supporters that he was running for his literal freedom, directly connecting his candidacy to escaping these legal problems.
Exactly. And that rhetoric really resonated with some voters. The idea that the justice system could be used for political reasons. Trump kept saying these investigations were just politically motivated witch hunts, started by his opponents.
So we're not just talking about legal details here.
Right.
We're talking about perception and public trust in our important institutions. How can we even begin to separate legitimate legal action from what might be politically motivated?
Well, that's where it gets tough. Even if the cases against Trump were completely legit and evidence-based, the fact that they were dropped as soon as he got back into power really feeds that narrative of a rigged system.
Yeah, his spokesperson was quick to say that the American people and President Trump want an end to the political weaponization of our justice system. But doesn't that raise the question of who decides what political weaponization even is?
Absolutely. It's a term that gets thrown around all the time these days, and it often seems to depend on what political party you support. If you like Trump, you probably see these cases as politically motivated attacks. But if you don't like him, you might see them as legitimate attempts to hold him accountable for potential wrongdoing.
So we have this conflict between the need to uphold the law and the possibility that the law itself could be seen, whether it's fair or not, as a way to achieve political goals. It's complicated for sure. But even though the federal cases are gone, this legal story isn't over yet, is it?
No, not at all. While those charges have been dropped, the evidence from the investigations is still there, and people are going to keep talking about it. And it could even start new investigations, maybe by Congress or even another special counsel in the future.
And then there are those state-level cases that Trump is still facing, like the one in Georgia about election interference, and his conviction in New York on felony charges.
Those cases weren't affected by the DOJ policy, and they bring up a whole new set of complications. It's never happened before that a sitting president is facing potential criminal charges at the state level.
This is where it gets really interesting. What happens if those cases go to trial while Trump is still president?
Well, we're going to find out, aren't we? It's going to be fascinating and possibly very messy. But before we get into the potential chaos of a president on trial, let's take a step back and look at the history of all this. Why does this policy against indicting a sitting president even exist? And what are the arguments for and against it? This policy isn't just some random rule, It comes from a deep concern about keeping the presidency stable and working.
Okay, but I'm still thinking about this idea. If we say a president shouldn't be bothered by legal stuff while they're running the country, what happens when those legal problems are about how they're running the country?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there are good arguments on both sides. Some legal scholars say that allowing a president to be indicted while they're in office could lead to a bunch of pointless or politically motivated prosecutions. It could basically paralyze the executive branch.
So every political opponent who's unhappy could tie up the president in court and stop them from doing their job.
Exactly. And then there's the argument that criminal proceedings against a sitting president would make people lose confidence in the office itself, and that could lead to instability and even chaos.
I see that. But what about accountability? What kind of message does it send if the most powerful person in the country seems to be above the law? Doesn't that damage public trust in the justice system even more?
It's a tough balance, and it's important to remember that this policy doesn't mean a president can't be held responsible for their actions. It just means those consequences might be delayed. They could face impeachment by Congress, for example, or they could be prosecuted after they leave office.
So it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's more like a rain check.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And in Trump's case, we're seeing those potential consequences play out right now with those state-level cases.
Yeah.
The fact that these cases are moving forward while he's president is something we've never seen before. It's uncharted territory.
It's crazy to think about the logistics of it all.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a president having to deal with affairs of state and also court appearances, legal strategies, maybe even trials.
It would be super disruptive, to say the least, and just the image of it all. A president on trial would be incredibly divisive. It would probably make political tensions even worse and raise questions about the fairness and impartiality of the justice system.
And don't forget about the impact on international relations. How would other countries see a U.S. president who's in the middle of legal battles? Would they see him as a legitimate leader?
It could definitely hurt America's standing in the world. It might affect diplomatic talks, trade deals, and even national security. It makes you wonder if other countries would trust the U.S. to keep its promises if its own leader is dealing with serious legal problems.
It's like a ripple effect.
Yeah.
These legal cases could impact everything from politics within the U.S. to global affairs. But stepping back from those specific implications for a minute, I think it's worth thinking about the bigger philosophical questions this raises. If a president can seemingly avoid legal consequences for things that would get anyone else in trouble, doesn't that undermine the whole idea of the rule of law?
That's a question that's been around for a long time. It's the classic problem of power versus accountability. How do we make sure that people in authority are held responsible for what they do without messing up the very systems that give them that authority?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
Not really. It's a constant back and forth, a balancing act between different values and interests. And the answer might change depending on the specific situation, how serious the alleged offenses are, and what the potential consequences of taking action would be.
In this situation with Trump, some critics say that dismissing the federal cases sets a bad example. They're worried that it tells future presidents that they can do whatever they want because they're basically untouchable while in office.
And those concerns are definitely valid. But others might say that the DOJ policy is necessary to protect the presidency from being weakened by politically motivated prosecutions. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers.
It's clear that this isn't just about Trump, though, right? This whole thing has shown us a weakness in our system of government, a tension between the need for accountability and the need to make sure the executive branch can work properly.
Absolutely. And that weakness has been made worse by how politically divided our country is. When people don't trust institutions and political parties are so far apart, it's really hard to deal with these kinds of legal and ethical challenges.
So what does all this mean for accountability in American politics going forward? If a president can maybe avoid legal consequences while in office, what can we do to make sure they don't abuse their power?
That's the question we're going to have to keep thinking about as the story develops. And it's a question that needs our attention, our critical thinking, and our participation as citizens. Because in the end, the future of our democracy depends on our ability to hold our leaders accountable, no matter what party they belong to or how much power they have.
We've really stumbled into some kind of constitutional paradox, haven't we? On one hand, we have this idea that no one is above the law, but then we have this policy that seems to protect the president from legal consequences while they're in office. How do we make sense of those two ideas?
Yeah, that tension is really at the core of this whole thing. It makes us face this uncomfortable question. What happens when the person who's supposed to uphold the law is the one maybe breaking it?
And it's not just some theoretical question anymore. This is happening right now. And it has real consequences for our democracy.
You're right. This isn't just about legal details or party politics. This is about the basic principles of how our government works, the rule of law, the balance of power, the whole idea of justice.
When those federal cases against Trump were dismissed, some legal experts said it could set a bad precedent. They were worried that it could encourage future presidents to do whatever they want because they know they're basically untouchable while they're in office.
Sure. And that's a valid concern. If presidents think they can operate outside the law, it could really weaken accountability and our democratic institutions.
But then there's the other side of the argument. that indicting a sitting president could create a lot of chaos and instability.
Imagine a president constantly facing legal challenges, maybe even having to go to trial while trying to run the country. It could completely paralyze the executive branch and make it impossible for the president to govern effectively.
So we're trying to balance accountability with protecting the presidency. It's like we're stuck in a constitutional puzzle with no solution.
And that puzzle gets even harder to solve when you consider how divided our politics are. When people don't trust institutions and political parties are so far apart, even legal actions that are legitimate can be seen as political attacks.
Which brings us back to that phrase, the political weaponization of the justice system. Both sides use it often to discredit legal actions they don't like.
And that's dangerous because it makes people lose trust in the justice system itself. If people think the law is just a tool for powerful people, it weakens the foundation of our democracy.
So what do we do now? If this DOJ policy is supposed to protect the presidency, but it also might create chances for abuse of power, how do we move forward in a way that upholds both the rule of law and the presidency?
That's the big question, and I don't have a simple answer. It might mean looking at the policy again, maybe making clearer rules or exceptions for really bad offenses. It might also mean both political parties need to work together to tone down the rhetoric and to build back trust in the justice system as an impartial judge of the law.
That's a lot to ask, especially in our current political climate. But ultimately, the future of our democracy depends on finding a way to hold our leaders accountable without weakening the institutions that protect our freedoms.
This deep dive has really taken us into uncharted territory. It's forced us to look at some uncomfortable truths about how power can be abused and how hard it is to ensure accountability at the highest levels of government. But it's a conversation we have to have, because what's at stake is too important to ignore.
We've looked at the legal complexities, the historical background, and the philosophical questions at the heart of this issue. But as always, the most important thing is this: stay informed, stay involved, and keep asking the tough questions. The future of our democracy depends on it. And that concludes our deep dive from the Fast Times News. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more insights into current events. Until next time, stay curious.